Terry Evans and Elizabeth Farnsworth did this amazing project for us as research fellows. I should say, by the way, that Ken Goldberg is also a research fellow with the Center for Art and Environment. And we're very interested in this idea of a telescape. We look at creative interactions, human creative interactions with natural-built and virtual environments. And we don't have a lot of the virtual work in-house. Ken is the leader of that for us, so we're going to be talking. Terry Evans, you know, I mean, I grew up in the West. I've lived in Reno, Santa Fe, Los Angeles, Portland. And I didn't know much about the prairie. But I started looking at the work of the photographer Terry Evans. And Terry was doing these amazing photographs basically taken from her waist, looking down at ensembles of plants and the patterns that these little prairie plants would make and how beautiful they were, these exquisite photographs. And then by the time she, I could really come across her work, she's doing aerial work maybe 1,000 feet or more above the landscape. She's still in the nap of the landscape. She's not up at 10,000 feet. She's still in it, but suddenly you start to see relationships in that same landscape that are akin to the same patterns that you saw at the ground from her waist level, and that was a very conscious thing on her part. She was investigating pattern. And it revealed all of these interesting things. And she'll talk about some of these patterns. But I mean, it revealed the relationship between an old military World War II base and farming bales. And you could see these bunker shapes and the bales and like, oh, I've never seen that kind of relationship of two very different kinds of patterns together before. So she was creating new knowledge in an old scale way, if you will, in an analog way. Elizabeth Farnsworth is a noted telecorrespondent. She was a senior anchor with the PBS NewsHour, an extraordinarily important filmmaker, has dealt in theaters of conflict around the world. Both of these women grew up on the prairie, and they were friends. And they were really curious about what was going on in North Dakota, in the Bakken, in the oil fields, where hydraulic fracking was going on. And we began to talk with them about this project of maybe spending a year or a little bit more going up to North Dakota and looking at what was going on, looking at what the effects were. And an extraordinary thing happened. Terry enlarged her, Terry makes many different kinds of photographs. She does aerial photography, ground photography, all sorts of things. But one thing she hadn't spent maybe so much time doing was really looking at portraits on the faces of people. And so they're looking at this industrial development, and she's taking portraits. Amazing. And you're looking at what's going on in the landscape reflected in the faces. And Elizabeth, who is, this extraordinary nonfiction documentary person, is carrying around a volume of poetry, Tom McGrath's Letter to an Imaginary Friend, which is the definitive book of poems in a way about that part of the country. And she is realizing there is a response to this situation that is equally poetic as well as it is documentary and nonfiction. So it's another kind of teamwork, isn't it? It's another kind of team. This time a team centering around just one project. They made multiple trips into the region over 18 months. The very small archive, the leading edge of the archive, is on exhibition in the library upstairs with some photographs and journals and so forth. It's a tremendous little archive show for a very big, very important project. Please help me welcome Terry Evans and Elizabeth Farnsworth. Chris, do we have to start something?
What's that?
Yeah, start the loop.
Yeah.
I think I should sit at the couch, or should I stand at the podium? Stand at the podium. Sit on the couch. Talk about crowdsourcing, right?
It's been a long day.
It's pretty good. Terry, may I start with you? I waited till you were sipping water to ask you that question, yeah. Would you talk about that process of scale in your work, starting out photographing more or less almost at ground level, and how that changed for you?
Okay. Well, when I started looking at the prairie, I was looking at the untouched prairie ecosystem at the Virgin Prairie. This was an 80-acre piece of land in Kansas, in the middle of Kansas, where I lived then. And my friend Wes Jackson of the Land Institute was doing some research there. And I started looking at the ground, and in March, nothing much was growing in Kansas. And gradually, everything started growing, and this looked vastly different than my front yard. And so I kept photographing. So for about a year and a half, this is a little bit like PETA's fish. So for a year and a half, I did black and white photographs. I made about 6,000 black and white photographs of the ground. What you're seeing here are not those photographs. You're seeing our North Dakota project. And that was 35 years ago that I was photographing the ground, maybe 36 years ago. And it was the first time I'd really seen an untouched ecosystem. And it just simply changed my life. And I started wanting to know everything about it. And everything I've done since then has been in some way ordered by that first revelation, which led me in all kinds of other directions about history and ancient art and medicinal uses of plants and Plains Indians' uses of plants, and gradually to the human marks on the prairie, and gradually to the aerial perspective, because I knew this medieval saying, as above, so below. And so I wanted to see were the patterns really the same from when I went, if I were to go to a higher altitude and look down at the ground. And in fact, they were. So that has sort of inspired everything else.
That's perfect. Elizabeth, you and I have talked a lot about what journalistic practice is and your responsibilities when you're a journalist in the field. And this was a very different kind of project. I know you still carried some of those responsibilities with you. And I wonder, because I don't think many of us in the audience know what it's really like to be a journalist. And it's a very challenging task that society sets before you. So if you could just sort of share a little bit about what the journalistic concerns are, and then when you walk into a project like this, how it's different.
You know, I've thought, we've talked about this, and we've talked about this, and it's a conversation that I'd like to keep having with people here. It's not that different in some ways. I keep thinking about that James Agee line that he wants to see the cruel radiance of what is. And I think that journalists, at least the journalists I know and the journalists I worked with, I've spent my life mostly as a foreign correspondent. It's a certain kind of journalist, but we're almost obsessively curious about what's happening. And you have to bring everything you can to that to understand what's happening. And if you're the kind of person that becomes a foreign correspondent, that means you can't go to Israel if you don't read Amos Oz. You can't go to Turkey if you don't read Orhan Pamuk. You've got to read novels and poetry and history and geology and geography if you have the time. Sometimes we don't have the time. So that's what I wanted to bring to this. I wanted to know what was happening to people in North Dakota, and I was so lucky because I wouldn't have probably made Prairie the star of the show, which it's what makes this. We have an exhibit at the Field Museum in Chicago. It was there for a year. We have a traveling exhibit. And what makes this work is Terry's deep, deep knowledge and affection of Prairie. The whole show is about what's happening to the Prairie and the people on it, basically.
Terry, why don't you tell us a little bit about these images that we're kind of rotating through?
Okay, I can't see them, but I just have this.
You can stand up and actually sort of half look at that, and you can.
Well, you know, I've seen them.
Okay.
But something happened this morning that I wanted to tell you about, and it may be premature in this conversation, but I don't want to forget it. And it has to do with the portraits. And Bill mentioned that I did portraits. And Elizabeth, and by the way, Elizabeth is a formidable researcher, and so, you know, it was such a grand experience to work with someone of such depth. And there were so many stories to tell, and So I finally realized, and I won't tell you this whole story of how I came to do the portraits, but I realized that every single person we met was in some way connected with the oil boom. So that if I started making portraits, then each face would contain probably a different story that had something to do with the oil boom. And so I started doing these portraits with this lens that I had actually rented to do aerial work with. And I liked it that I could fill the frame with their faces. So this morning I was upstairs and I saw the beautiful lion portrait by, is it Arnold Zuckerman? Andrew, I knew I had that wrong, I'm sorry. Is he here? That the lion's face, you know, looking right into the camera, and it seemed something like these portraits, and I read about how the lion and all the animals he photographed were captured. Well, they weren't captured. They might have been in captivity or they might have been injured. They were being well cared for, all of them. And so I thought, aren't we just like that? You know, aren't our faces just like that? We're all in captivity and we're all pretty well cared for. But, you know, we're still captive, and in this case, and, you know, we're captive to oil. So that's what our whole project is about in some ways.
It's a huge story, this Bakken story. I mean, I think most of you probably know a lot about it. It's the largest continual oil field in the world, 15,000 acres in North Dakota. President Obama's, as you know, become quite a booster of our oil and gas prowess, the bounty that we have, and is using it in foreign policy. I don't think he could be doing what he's doing with Iran without it. We're not so dependent on the Middle East anymore. I don't think I'm telling all of you anything you don't already know. But it is the prairie. North Dakota was about 18% prairie, one of the largest amounts of prairie anywhere. And it's not going to last very long. It's being little by little by little destroyed. If it's not destroyed, it's fragmented, and all of you that know about natural systems know that fragmentation is terrible. It is providing fabulous living to people that have the good jobs in the oil field. North Dakota has less than a 3% unemployment rate right now. Their schools have plenty of money. People are moving in like crazy. You've heard about all this. So everything we've been talking about in the past days is happening there. And in a way, as sad as it was, we were very privileged, really, to be able to see it, because we started working in 2011, and our last trip was November 2012. And the production doubled in that time. It's now tripled. The technology, I used Walt Whitman in one of the blogs that we wrote for the center's website, because he sang the technological achievements of an earlier era. And if you could put yourself in his mindset, the technological achievements of fracking and the way they're going to do this oil boom they're doing 1280, two sections on top of each other with oil wells 4 miles apart. In some places, in a lot of places, they won't be close to each other the way you see them in Texas. It's an incredible technological achievement. It's going to happen all over the world, and we all know what it means for global warming. So to be exploring an oil boom in the era of global warming was a deeply affecting process, I think, for both of us.
People around the world have been interested in this project because fracking's coming to their doorstep. So we're getting calls and emails about, what do you have on this project? People come in constantly and say, we want to see more. They say, do you have more portraits? Well, why do you want to see that? Because they're thinking about fracking in my community, and I want to see what it does to people's faces. And I find that we've never had that kind of response before to an archive of a project that's taken place. It's been extraordinary.
And think of the history involved here. This is Lewis and Clark country. And the ranchers that you're seeing, that's all natural prairie. That was the prairie that Scott Davis, a rancher who most of his ranch is natural prairie. He moves his cattle around so much that he's able to feed them on natural prairie and keep it healthy. Terry said it was the healthiest natural prairie where cattle were feeding she'd seen. And you understand that you can't stop somebody from drilling. He only owned a tiny number of the mineral rights under that prairie. He could not stop them from making a 15-acre oil pad on his prairie and fracking and drilling. And you'll get a minimal, he gets paid for the surface rights, even though he would have said no if he could have. It's hardly anything. And for the mineral rights under it, it's almost nothing. And you can't turn it down. In this country, you don't own, many people have sold their mineral rights. Half the money from the oil boom in North Dakota goes outside the state, the mineral rights money.
Sarah, how are we doing on time? How much time do we have? 18 minutes for questions. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. This is a topic I think that really stirs people, and people have an enormous number of questions. If you need my mic, you can.
That's the rancher's daughter who's making very good money in oil, by the way. Contradictions everywhere.
One of the things that we like, when I give lectures about what we do at the Center for Art and Environment, I'll look at an Ansel Adams photograph, for example, and say, well, look, here's Lone Pine, and here's the Eastern Sierra at sunrise, and you think, we've got a question right here in the center up here. And, you think, gosh, that's a beautiful photograph of the Edenic life of the American West. And you realize he's erased the letters of Lone Pine, LP, on the photograph. And then you realize that the line of trees that's behind the horse that's grazing so peacefully is the LA aqueduct that Lauren Bond's been dealing with. So we like to make stories more complicated. We don't want to simplify things. We want to do the opposite. We want to make it more complicated. And this is one of those projects where that happens. So please.
I'm from Australia. In Australia, the fracking juggernaut is starting to hit our shores as well. But what we're finding is that the farming communities are standing up, and we have the same issue with mineral rights being not owned by the people who own the land. But there's an association, for example, called Lock the Gate. And they are physically locking their gates and really delaying the process, which is causing great grief for the poor oil companies. So just wondering whether there's something similar going on in North Dakota, or is the lure of the money too great?
When we started, we kept. Oh, I'm sorry. When we started, we kept looking for the resistors, and we did find a small group of resistance, which has grown. And I think you've been closely in touch with them.
This was part of the privilege of being there, because they really began to get together in the 2 years that we were working. We went 7 times, and I've gone back since, and Terry's been in, we became very close friends with some people, so we know what's happening. I even got on the phone a conference call of the Dakota Resource Council. Think about this a minute. This is what really hit me about this call. They were planning, it's the Resource Council's oil and gas sort of subcommittee, and they were getting ready to lobby against the 500 feet that oil facilities can be to your front door. They want it to be 800 to 1,000 feet. In North Dakota, this is a huge area. We probably drove, I don't know how many, tens of thousands of miles in the time we were there. Of course, we were very aware we were using oil. But they would say, can you get to Bismarck? I think it was January, February. It was right before we started the blog that they were on the phone. I was on the phone with them, and the legislature only meets once every 2 years, so this is like really important. And by the way, our exhibit's going to be up in Bismarck when it meets next in March. And they were 300 miles away from each other and 200 miles from Bismarck. So they couldn't get together to meet. It was hard to get to Bismarck in February, snow. I mean, the organizing, I think about it as an organizer, person that's been around a lot of organizers in my life. For an organizer, it's really tough. But yes, there's a movement. They're doing the same kind of thing. I don't think they're locking the gate, but they're beginning to make a lot of waves and asking for things. And I think they're hoping very much to get better regulation in this session of the legislature. I don't know how much they're going to succeed.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, with these portraits of people there, the social dynamics in North Dakota are changing so dramatically because of the influx of young men in particular coming and just having really significant social challenges because the structure of the culture is changing so much.
I can talk, I think we can talk more about how the local long-time residents have been affected. We met and talked to a number of oil workers, number of men who had come to North Dakota, and for some people it was almost a lark. They thought they knew or felt they knew that they could come and get rich quick. For other people, it was there was a lot of sadness and loss involved. This was the end of the line, and they were desperate, and maybe they could get a job here. And for other people, we met very highly trained engineers. We met, one of the portraits you see up there is Freddie from Uruguay, who was the directional driller who controlled the fracking 3,000 feet deep. He controlled it on his computer above the surface. And we met roustabouts who were making $17 an hour. So, but the local people's lives were radically changed. One of the families that we became very close to, the Davis family, this was the ranch family, and Scott said, how did he say it? Our lives...
Lives will never be the same.
Yeah.
They'll never be the same again. The question about the people coming in is an interesting one. One day, we just walked up into this very small trailer camp, and it was in White Earth. The White Earth Valley is where we did a lot of our work. It's one of the most beautiful places you could ever imagine going. I think one of my main goals, I can't stand the word flyover. Do not speak the words the flyover area of the United States. People honestly said to us, who cares if they're drilling oil up there? There's nothing there. I mean, this idea that land doesn't count, I don't think that the prairie was even mentioned in the early articles about the oil boom. So that was one of the things I loved about Thomas McGrath, because he writes so beautifully about it. But in any case, in the White Earth Valley, we go up into this brand new trailer park, and we start talking to people, and Terry's taking pictures, and it's an amazing picture. It's a trailer park. It's a great picture with she's got hanging plants, and her story was they'd lost their Midas muffler shops in St. Louis. And it might have been for the recession, or maybe something happened. We never got that straight. This was early 2011, so the recession was still really strong. And somebody else had lost their business in Minneapolis. Most of them had been affected by the recession. So we're talking to these people, and here comes the guy that has rented the school, the old White Earth School. White Earth, by the way, was the largest grain shipping place for years in the Midwest. And it was where all the pioneers got off, and including my well, they were a little further south, but my great-great-grandparents, and settled the Dakotas. And this guy comes striding towards us and gets in front of us and walks us back to the street and said, look at this, there's a no trespassing sign, I could have you arrested. And then he said, you can't talk to these people. Every person in here is suffering. They've lost something, they're miserable, they've lost their families, they don't have any money. You can't talk to these people. I won't let you, we won't let you make whatever you're making out of their suffering. And then that reminded us of our one of the favorite people we met, who was a Dakota resource person who wrote a letter to the editor of the Williston paper that we quote a lot, where she said, you know, I just want my life to be what it was. I'm picking up oil-coated ducks, and I can't herd my cattle anymore on the roads, and all of the things I loved have changed. And why do we have to be the place that solves the employment problems of the country? And it's all relevant to everything we've been talking about.
Here, and then we have a question up front here, too.
Could you talk a little bit about the symbiosis of the two of you working together, and in particular, the wisdom and insight that you draw from each other, or have drawn from each other in this process?
I just want to say that's Jamie Stillings, a photographer who's been photographing the Ivanpah Power Project out in the Mojave.
We'll just smile. We'll just smile at each other. Well, y- uh, you know, it wasn't all easy. It wasn't a perfect marriage. Both Elizabeth and I have been doing what we each do for a long time. And we were friends back in the 70s, and we saw each other from time to time thereafter. So we thought we knew each other, but it's not the same as getting in a car and driving for days across North Dakota.
Really not great food and not a great place to stay either.
Really not. And so we discovered that we each are quite strong-willed.
Surprise.
What a shock to me. And we discovered that as a journalist, well, we discovered that we had the same human values, but professionally, our values weren't quite the same. They weren't quite a match. And so some things would come up that one of us would feel was, well, of course, we would do it that way, you know, and we would feel passionately about that, or we didn't even know we felt passionately about it until the other one said, well, no, I think we should do it this way. And so that was challenging. But the thing is, the story was so huge and so complicated and so compelling to both of us that we felt like that was what we were serving.
And we're just as good friends as we were, if not better.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost like family sisters where you'll have a disagreement. So it worked out great. And I think Terry and I argue about this. I really think I benefited the most. To have an artist to work with is so great for a journalist. I'll give you an example of how we would be different. I've told Bill this, and he said it happens with the photographers he works with. Imagine me out with a documentary cameraman. He may be a very great documentary cameraman or woman. They've all been men in the films I've made. I pretty much say what I want him to shoot because I know what I'm going to need. And then I give him time where he can go off by himself and do what he wants to do too. And I would say to Terry, wouldn't it be a really good idea to shoot this or that? No, wouldn't be a good picture. And you don't really tell an artist what to do. And I wouldn't have been, I don't mean I was telling her, but of course she knows what, Bill used to say they're wired differently. She and I are we're just wired completely differently. And thank heavens, I don't think if we were younger, maybe it would have been an ego thing. I don't think we ever had an ego problem about it. We just had to work it out. That's all.
Mimi?
And I benefited the most.
I think the greatest gift as a writer to travel with a photographer is that you don't mediate the experience by having a camera yourself, but so you can still write and you can still look without a lens in between you and the land, but you're right next to a photographer who's doing that work, so you're allowed to learn what they're seeing, and then, of course, they take the photograph that you get to look at afterwards. I think it's like the best deal in the world. Mimi.
So this is.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's not Mimi. No, it's Rita?
I'm
Yes.
sorry. This is not really an art question. It's more a how to fight fracking question. From what I've learned, that the Clean Water Act has been the piece of legislation that gives the public the best right to question the right of frackers. What's happening in this region? Is it the Clean Water Act, or are there other pieces of legislation that the public in this area have been able to use that we should learn about?
The Clean Water Act does accept a lot of this, so it's not really helpful in this way. This is a complicated question, and I don't know all the answers. There are probably people here that know a lot more answers. I have not seen. There's just recently been a big legal case that happened that's very important, but it's not about water. It's about damage to a land that needed to be beautiful because, get this, it's a hunting land and nobody wants to come if there's oil on it. And they've gotten $1 million in damages. It's the first big case of this sort that might be able to help some people. But the fight against fracking, I mean, as you all know, it's really hottest elsewhere. It's hottest in New York State and in Colorado and other places like that. It hasn't, that particular battle has not gotten hot in North Dakota yet. They're really at a much more basic level. They're trying to stop from having, they had, I mean, the waste pits, the well waste pits, this has now changed, but they were all open and on their lands, and they would spill, and they're at such a basic level right now. And I think truly, I don't think I really know how to answer what, if anybody is now fighting fracking, but I haven't seen anything about it or heard about it, using the law in that way.
Question up here. And there's a question. So first we're going to go, where are we going to go? Right now.
Hello?
Right here. Okay.
I was just curious if you wanted to take on a new project in Nevada, because just recently, within the last few months, the BLM has been letting leases for northeast Nevada, and now they're talking about Smoky Valley in central Nevada, which is a really beautiful place, and they're planning on coming in, and right now, like, Smoky Valley is untouched with fracking, but so you could get the front end of that. Anyway.
That's not a project that these guys are going to take on, but I'm going to bet that there are people here who are going to be interested in doing that. So, microphone is here, so we've got a question right here, up front as well, and we have a question back here with Caroline. Carolyn? I'm sorry. No, and Sarah's looking at me like going, no, we can't. One more question? One more question. Okay.
Bill, is that? I'm Mary. Okay, I'll go.
Okay,
Terry.
good. Okay.
Hi,
no.
thank
Okay.
you. This is really great, wonderful project. I'm Maridel Terry, and I'm really wondering if you would give us a sense, Elizabeth, when you said, Elizabeth Elaine. Pardon me. Okay, Elizabeth, when you started to describe that entry into that place where there are all the people with the stories that they wouldn't let you hear, and I'm watching the portraits, and I'm knowing you have this exhibition, which I can't wait to see at the Field Museum. I hope it's still there.
No, now it's traveling in North Dakota.
Okay, so I want to see it. So my big question is, there are the stories from those faces, and I'm aware of that culture that goes with fracking, of the young men that come and the young women. I have a kind of a distant relative who ran off with her boyfriend up there to make $1 trillion. You know, so that drug culture, and in New Mexico, we really fear this. We were able to stop fracking 3 or 4 years ago, and now with our new Republican governor, it's all coming back. So those stories, how in the exhibition does it work where we see the portraits and we see those maps, those amazing faces, and I mean, they're just amazing faces. How are those stories coming across? Where's your writing? How is it working?
The Field Museum, doing it at the Field Museum of Natural History, of course, was a certain kind of exhibit.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those stories are simply told in the captions, and they're not really in the captions. Although Terry has a way of putting 5 words in a caption that tells you everything you'd want to know. It's pretty great.
But Elizabeth wrote exquisite text panels in, they were almost like poetry because there are such rigid requirements about number of words on text panels that museums have.
Reminded me of my high school yearbook.
Yeah, right.
So the stories are at least suggested in the text
And then we
panels.
use a lot of Thomas McGrath's poetry, too.
Okay.
I mean, everything that he wrote about is happening again. It's boom. Dakotas, as you know, have had many booms of various kinds, and it's all happening again. And he's writing about, in a way, it's what Wendell Berry says. We're all boomers, and he's writing about the life of all these people that have been part of this culture of heartbreak, and greed, and then greatness, and hope, and then heartbreak, and over again. So the poetry says a lot of it too.
Great.
Terry and
Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. Thank you.